Imagine walking through the streets of a city in the middle of summer and seeing someone dancing. Not celebrating, not performing, not happy, just dancing, alone, frantically, unable to stop. Now imagine coming back the next day and seeing 10 people doing it, then 100, then 400, all of them moving without rest, without choice, without any explanation anyone could agree on, their feet bleeding through their shoes, their bodies giving out, and some of them dying. Not from anything a doctor could point to, not from a wound or a fever or a poison anyone could name, just from dancing. That is not a fairy tale. That is not a fever dream pulled from some dark corner of folklore. That is something that actually happened in a real city, recorded by real officials, witnessed by real people who had absolutely no idea what they were seeing or how to stop it. It happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, and it remains one of the strangest, most genuinely unsettling events in recorded human history. And here's what makes it so hard to shake. Over 500 years later, with all of our science, all of our medicine, all of our understanding of the human brain and body, we still cannot fully explain it. We have theories. We have very smart people arguing very confidently on multiple sides. But a clean, definitive answer? It doesn't exist. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The core of the mystery isn't just that people danced when they didn't want to. It's that it spread. One person became dozens, became hundreds, over the course of just a few weeks. It moved through a city like something contagious, except it wasn't contagious in any way medicine recognized then, or recognizes cleanly now. And for some of those people caught in it, it wasn't just an ordeal, it was fatal. People collapsed from exhaustion, from strokes, from heart failure, their bodies simply destroyed by the relentless involuntary movement. So what happened? That is the question that has haunted historians, neurologists, psychologists and medical researchers for centuries. Was it a fungus in the food supply? Something in the grain that hijacked the nervous system and sent it spiraling? Was it a mass psychological event? Something that began in one mind and somehow leapt from person to person through the invisible machinery of fear and suggestion and shared belief? Was it a neurological condition? Some disease moving quietly through a weakened population? Was it something rooted in the specific terror and despair of that particular time and place? A world so saturated with suffering that the mind finally broke open in the most dramatic way imaginable. Here's the honest answer. All of those explanations have serious evidence behind them. All of them also have serious gaps. Each theory gets you partway to understanding and then runs into something it can't quite account for. And that's exactly why this story is still being debated today, still being written about in academic journals, still pulling researchers into archives and laboratories hoping to be the one who finally cracks it. What we know for certain is almost stranger than the theories. There are municipal records, there are physician reports, there are chronicles written by people close enough to the events to have seen them firsthand. This was not a rumour passed down through generations until it became mythology. The dancing plague of 1518 left a paper trail, and that trail is both deeply credible and deeply bizarre in equal measure. Over the weeks to come in this story, we're going to go through all of it. We're going to meet the woman who most accounts say started it all, a single person who began dancing in the street one July day and could not stop. We're going to look at exactly what the records say and what they don't say, because the gap between those two things matters enormously. We're going to examine how the city authorities responded, and honestly, their response is one of the most astonishing parts of the whole thing. We're going to dig into the medical and psychological theories, the ergot poisoning argument, the mass psychogenic illness framework, the religious dimension that shaped how people in 1518 understood and experienced what was happening to them. And we're going to sit with the uncomfortable reality that none of these explanations, not a single one, fully closes the case. Because that's the thing about a mystery this old and this strange. It doesn't resolve neatly. It keeps opening up the more carefully you look at it. Every answer generates 3 more questions. Every theory illuminates one corner of the room while leaving the rest in shadow. And if you're watching this right now, if you're listening to this voice at whatever strange hour you found yourself in, I genuinely want to know where you are and what time it is for you. Whether it's 3 a.m. in Tokyo or a slow Tuesday afternoon in Toronto or somewhere in the middle of a European evening where the streets outside actually look a little like what we're about to describe, drop it in the comments. I check them. There's something about a story this global and this unresolved that makes it feel right to know who's out here in the dark with it, across all these different time zones, all these different cities, all connected by the same strange pull toward a question that has never been fully answered. Because that pull, that feeling of needing to understand something that refuses to be understood, might be the most human thing there is. And 500 years ago in Strasbourg, that very human need to understand was being tested in a way nobody there had ever experienced. The summer was hot. The city was suffering. And somewhere in a street that no longer exists, a woman began to dance and could not stop. This is where the story starts. To understand why something like this could happen, you have to understand the world it happened in. Not in a vague background noise kind of way. You have to actually stand in it, feel the weight of it, smell it. Because Strasbourg in 1518 was not a city experiencing a quiet, ordinary summer. It was a city under pressure in almost every direction simultaneously, and that pressure matters enormously for every theory we're going to look at later. Strasbourg in the early 16th century was not a small backwater. It was a genuinely significant place, one of the major cities of the Holy Roman Empire sitting on the Rhine at the crossroads between what is now France and Germany, positioned to be a hub of trade, politics, religion, and ideas. The empire itself was a sprawling, complicated political structure, not a unified nation in any modern sense, but a patchwork of territories, city-states, principalities, and ecclesiastical holdings, all nominally under the authority of an emperor, but operating with enormous local variation and independence. Strasbourg was what was called a free imperial city, which meant it had a degree of autonomy that most places didn't. It answered to the emperor in theory, but governed itself through its own council in practice. Its merchants were prosperous, its guilds were powerful, its streets were crowded with a diverse mix of traders, craftspeople, clergy, scholars, and the poor who lived in the margins of all that activity. Population estimates put Strasbourg at somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people in this period. By the standards of the time, that made it a genuinely large city. And a large city in the early 16th century meant density in ways that are difficult to fully imagine from our current vantage point. Streets were narrow, buildings were close together, sanitation was limited to whatever could be managed by the basic systems of the day, which were not adequate to the load being placed on them. Human and animal waste, garbage, the byproducts of various trades and crafts, all of this concentrated in a medieval urban environment, where the concept of germ theory was still 3 centuries away. And then came the summer heat. Summer in a city like that was a different kind of ordeal than summer is now. No refrigeration, limited clean water access, food that spoiled faster than it could be moved and sold. The smells alone would have been overwhelming to a modern visitor, but the smells were the least of it. The real danger was what the heat did to an already compromised sanitation situation. It accelerated rot. It intensified contamination. It created the conditions in which illness spread faster and hit harder than it did in cooler months. Summers in pre-industrial European cities were periods of measurably higher mortality. People knew this. They feared summer in a way that layered onto all the other fears they were already carrying. And those fears in 1518 were substantial and specific. The decade leading up to that summer had been extraordinarily difficult for the people of the Rhine Valley and the surrounding region. The harvest had been bad, repeatedly. Not catastrophically bad in the way that triggers immediate mass starvation, but chronically, grinding bad in the way that depletes reserves, drives up food prices, pushes the vulnerable closer and closer to the edge without quite tipping them over. Malnutrition was widespread, particularly among the poor, and the poor made up a substantial portion of Strasbourg's population. These were not people with reserves to draw on. They were people living close enough to destitution that a single bad season, a single illness, a single disruption to their work meant genuine hunger. And the diseases were real and present too. Plague was not ancient history to these people. It was a recurring feature of their lives. The Black Death of the mid-14th century had killed somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's population, and while that particular wave had passed, plague returned regularly in subsequent decades and into the 16th century. Smallpox, typhus, syphilis, which had appeared in epidemic form in Europe only a couple of decades before 1518, sweating sickness, a mysterious illness that appeared in England and eventually the continent, and killed with terrifying speed. These were not abstract threats, in fact. They were things that had taken neighbours, family members, people everyone in the city knew. You didn't read about epidemic disease in 1518. You watched it move through the people around you. So picture the collective psychological atmosphere of a city shaped by all of this. A population living with chronic nutritional stress, surrounded by familiar reminders of mortality, breathing summer air thickened by inadequate sanitation, operating within a political and social structure where the margin between stability and catastrophe felt genuinely thin. This was not a population of people living securely and calmly in a prosperous city. This was a population of people doing what human beings have always done when the world refuses to cooperate, trying to hold things together using whatever tools they had, including and especially the tools of belief. Because the belief systems operating in Strasbourg in 1518 were not separate from daily life. They were the framework through which daily life was understood and experienced. The Reformation had not yet come to Strasbourg in its full force, though it was coming. Martin Luther had posted his theses only the year before, in 1517, and the theological earthquake that would follow was still working its way through the fault lines of European Christianity. In 1518, Strasbourg was still formally Catholic, still organized around the rhythms and structures of the Church, still interpreting illness, suffering, and catastrophe through the lens of sin, divine punishment, intercession, and the complex geography of saints and their powers. This matters because when bodies broke down in that world, the explanation was never purely physical in the way we would look for physical explanations now. Suffering had meaning. Illness had causes that extended beyond the body into the moral and spiritual domain, and certain saints were associated with certain afflictions in ways that were not metaphorical to the people who believed them, but were understood as literally, practically true. Saint Vitus, a martyred child saint, was believed to be connected to a condition that caused involuntary convulsive movement. There was already a category in that culture for bodies that moved without control. There was already a name for it, a saint associated with it, a set of rituals connected to addressing it. The cultural scaffolding for something like a dancing plague already existed, waiting. This is one of the things that makes the 1518 event so difficult to disentangle. The physical and the psychological and the spiritual were not separate domains to the people living through it. When someone in that city saw unusual, uncontrolled movement in another person's body, they were not observing a neutral medical symptom. They were observing something that came preloaded with interpretation, with meaning, with fear, with a specific kind of religious significance that shaped how the observer responded, and potentially how the person experiencing it understood and continued to experience their own body. That's not ignorance. That's not superstition in the dismissive sense. That's what a fully integrated belief system does. It tells you what you're seeing before you finish seeing it, and that prior framework changes what happens next. It shapes behavior. It shapes social response. It creates feedback loops between experience and interpretation that can amplify things that might otherwise resolve quickly on their own. And in a city already under stress, already depleted, already primed by years of hardship to expect suffering and to look for its meaning, those feedback loops could run faster and hit harder than they might anywhere else. The environment was not just a backdrop. It was an active ingredient. The crowding, the sanitation, the malnutrition, the heat, the specific fears about specific diseases, the religious framework, the political tensions, the economic strain, all of these were not separate factors running parallel to the dancing plague. They were the conditions that made something like it possible. Maybe even the conditions that made it inevitable, given a sufficient trigger. We don't know exactly what the trigger was. We'll get into the specific person and the specific moment. But what we do know is that whatever began that summer did not begin in a neutral environment. It began in a city that was, in some sense, already stretched close to its limits. A city where the collective nervous system of a population had been under sustained, compounding pressure for years, where bodies were weakened, where minds were saturated with fear and religious meaning and the daily reality of watching people around them suffer. There's a principle in physics about critical states, about systems that have been pushed so close to a threshold that the smallest additional input can trigger a large, disproportionate response. Physicists call it being near a critical point. Historians and psychologists and medical researchers looking at 1518 Strasbourg don't usually use that language, but the intuition points in the same direction. By the summer of that year, this city had been pushed close enough to some kind of threshold that when the right person, or the wrong person, started dancing in the street and couldn't stop, the system was ready to respond in a way that defied every expectation of what a normal city, in a normal summer would do, that woman was named Frau Trophäa. And what she did next is where this story truly begins. She stepped out into the street, or so the story goes, and she began to dance. No music, no festival, no apparent reason that anyone around her could identify. Just a woman moving, unable or unwilling to stop in the summer heat of Strasbourg in July of 1518. Her name, as it has come down to us, was Frau Trophäa. That is essentially everything we know about her as a person. Not her first name, not her age, not her background or history or what she'd been doing in the hours before she started moving. The records that mention her are sparse and retrospective, meaning they were written after the fact by people trying to make sense of something that had already grown far beyond any single individual. What we have is a name attached to a starting point, the way historians sometimes identify the first case in an outbreak, not because that person is fully knowable, but because every sequence needs a point of origin, even a partial one. Some accounts say she danced for hours on that first day. Others suggest the episode that first drew attention was briefer, and that what made it alarming was not the duration initially, but the quality of the movement itself. There was something in how she moved that struck observers as wrong in a way that celebration or play would not have been, uncontrolled, compelled. Not the movement of a person choosing to dance, but the movement of a person being moved. The distinction mattered enormously in a culture already fluent in the language of spiritual affliction, already equipped with frameworks for understanding bodies that act against the will of the person inhabiting them. What happened over the following days is better documented, though still imperfect. She continued. She did not stop in the way that a person caught in an unusual moment of public behaviour would normally stop when the moment passed, or when the social discomfort of being watched became sufficient to interrupt whatever was happening. Instead, the dancing persisted through the day and into the evening, and then resumed. Contemporary sources, including a chronicle written by a physician who was in Strasbourg during the events, describe her dancing in the street for days, apparently without rest, her feet eventually raw and damaged from the sustained movement on hard surfaces. Here is where the accounts become simultaneously more vivid and more difficult to trust entirely, because the people writing them were not neutral observers equipped with modern frameworks for understanding what they were seeing. They were people shaped by exactly the belief systems we talked about in the last section. People for whom a woman dancing in the street without stopping was not a medical curiosity but a spiritual event, a sign, a symptom of something operating at a level beyond the ordinary. Their descriptions were filtered through that understanding from the first word, which means the vivid details they preserved for us were selected and framed by a set of assumptions we can't simply subtract from the record after the fact. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. Within approximately 4 to 7 days of Frau Trophäa's initial episode, she was no longer alone. The accounts differ on exactly how quickly the number grew, but multiple sources converge on the fact that it grew, meaningfully and visibly, within that first week. Other residents of Strasbourg began dancing, not in the organised way that festival dancing would look, not in the social way that people danced together in celebration, but in the same compulsive, apparently involuntary way that had characterised what observers saw in Frau Trophäa. By some accounts, the number reached somewhere between 15 and 30 people within that first week, though exact figures from this period should always be held loosely. The spread followed a pattern that would repeat as the weeks went on. Someone who had presumably witnessed the dancing or been in proximity to it would begin moving in the same way. The affliction jumped person to person, not through any mechanism anyone could observe directly, but through something in the watching, the proximity, the shared atmosphere of a city that was already primed by everything we have discussed. There was no obvious physical transmission, no shared food or water or contact that could explain why one person started dancing after another. And that absence of obvious physical mechanism was itself a kind of information, though it was information that pointed in very different directions depending on what explanatory framework you brought to it. Observers at the time described the dancers as unable to stop. That word, unable, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it represents a claim that the people making it were not in a position to verify in any rigorous sense. What they could observe was that people did not stop, that they appeared distressed by their own movement, that they showed signs of physical exhaustion while continuing anyway. Whether that inability was absolute, Whether it was physiological, psychological, or something that doesn't map cleanly onto either category is a question the original observers had no way to answer. But unable was the word they reached for, and it shaped everything that followed. The physical toll described in the accounts is striking regardless of mechanism. Dancers were reportedly sweating heavily, their eyes glazed or fixed in ways that suggested altered states of awareness. Some collapsed, and then, according to accounts, resumed dancing when they recovered consciousness. Their feet and legs showed damage consistent with sustained, uncontrolled physical movement over hours and then days. There are descriptions of people crying, of appearing terrified by what their own bodies were doing, of reaching toward bystanders in apparent appeals for help that didn't translate into any ability to actually cease the movement. Whether all of these details are accurate, whether some of them are embellished, whether the retrospective nature of several of the sources introduced distortions, these are genuinely open questions. The most frequently cited contemporary source is a physician's account, and it is valuable precisely because it approaches the events with some observational intent. But even this source was written by a man of his time, trained in the medical traditions of his era, interpreting what he saw through frameworks that were a mixture of ancient humoral theory and religious interpretation. Strict neutrality was not available to him any more than it is available to anyone. What we can say is that by the end of those first few days, something genuinely unusual was happening in Strasbourg that enough people could observe and agree upon to generate a record. One person had become several. The movement was spreading. The authorities were beginning to take notice. The city that we described in the previous section, already stressed and depleted and saturated with fear and religious meaning, was now confronted with a visible, embodied, undeniably strange thing happening in its streets. And the question of how to respond to it was not going to be answered quickly or cleanly, or in ways that would look anything like what a modern observer might expect. Frau Troffea herself disappears from the accounts fairly quickly. Some versions of the story say she was taken to a shrine of Saint Vitus, in the belief that the saint's intercession might bring relief. What happened to her after that is not recorded in any source that has survived. She recedes into uncertainty in the way that people without power and without names that commanded further documentation so often do. She gave the outbreak a point of origin in the historical record, and then she was gone from it. What she left behind was a city watching itself come apart in a way it had no clear script for, a spreading pattern of uncontrolled movement that was only just beginning, and a set of questions that Strasbourg's physicians, clergy and city council were about to discover they were very poorly equipped to answer. If you try to follow this outbreak step by step through time, the first thing you slam into is the record itself. Not the story as it appears in documentaries or listicles or spooky Reddit posts, but the actual paper trail left behind by the people who were there, or close enough in time to still be feeling the shockwaves. That paper trail is thinner than you might expect and stranger. At the core, historians lean on three kinds of evidence. First, there are the official documents, city council notes, administrative records, legal correspondence. These are the closest thing Strasbourg has to a civic memory. They weren't written to entertain or horrify. They were written to keep track of what the city was doing and why. In 1518, that meant recording things like expenditures, decrees, and consultations with experts. These records mention the dancing. They don't linger on it the way later storytellers would, but they acknowledge it as a problem serious enough to require action. We see entries about hiring musicians, about paying people to escort dancers to specific locations, about consulting physicians and clergy. The language is dry, bureaucratic, almost bored in places, and that is exactly why modern historians treat it as such a solid anchor. The council had no incentive to dramatize. It had incentives to be clear enough that future officials could understand what had been decided. Second, there are contemporary chronicles and letters, accounts written by people living either in Strasbourg or nearby territories, often within months or a few years of the outbreak. These might be the work of town clerks, local historians, or observers who folded the dancing outbreak into larger narratives about the region, political conflicts, religious tensions, famines, floods. These texts are more colourful than the council minutes. They talk about many dancers, a great multitude, people who leapt and writhed day and night. They describe the affliction in language already dripping with interpretation, calling it a plague, a curse, or a judgment. But chronologically, they are still fairly close to the events. Some were written by people who almost certainly had direct access to eyewitnesses, if they were not witnesses themselves. Then there is the third category, later retellings. These start appearing decades after the events, and then continue across centuries. Writers in the late 1500s, 1600s, and beyond reach back to 1518 as an example, a cautionary tale, a curiosity. Some are scholars compiling collections of marvels. Others are theologians cataloguing signs and prodigies. Still others are early medical writers seeking strange case histories to support their own pet theories about the body and mind. These later accounts tend to be the ones where the story gets really big and really dramatic. They are also the most likely to be quoted in modern summaries because they sound vivid and complete, in a way that bare council notes do not. The problem is that between these categories, official records, near-contemporary descriptions, and later retellings, details shift, numbers grow, motives are added. The line between what people in 1518 actually did and what later writers thought they must have done begins to blur. So what happens if we strip this story back down to what the earliest and least embellished sources actually say? From the council records, we get a few hard points. Somewhere between July and early September 1518, Strasbourg had enough people dancing uncontrollably in the streets that city authorities felt compelled to intervene. They did not treat this as a side issue or an amusing oddity. They spent money on it. They issued decrees. They conferred with medical and religious authorities, debated causes, and implemented at least one structured citywide response. These same documents give us indirect clues about severity. The council referred to the dance as a plague and as a matter of public order. That wording implies that what was happening was visible, disruptive, and persistent enough to interfere with normal urban life. Crowding streets, drawing attention, perhaps impeding market activity or public worship. You don't call a private, short-lived incident a plague. You reserve that language for something that feels socially contagious, threatening, expansive. From the chronicles we get more texture. Multiple near-contemporary accounts describe dozens of people dancing, and at least one medical writer who lived in Strasbourg refers explicitly to the phenomenon as affecting many citizens, concentrated but not limited to particular urban spaces. He emphasizes the compulsive quality of the movement, the anguish of the dancers, and the prolonged nature of the outbreak over weeks. This is also where we start seeing numbers. Not precise statistics, but rough indications. Phrases like more than 30, many scores, or several hundred appear, not all in the earliest documents and not all with the same confidence. Some writers simply speak of a crowd. Others give figures that sound suspiciously rounded, the historical equivalent of someone saying there were like hundreds of people there, when what they really mean is it looked like a lot. And then, with the later writers, we arrive at the large polished numbers that make good headlines. 400 dancers, 500, even more in some tellings. It's these later figures that are most often repeated as if they were hard data. They probably aren't. To understand why, you have to think about how pre-modern writers counted, and what they meant when they wrote a number on a page. Nobody in 1518 was standing in a city tower, clipboard in hand, ticking off each individual dancer as they spun past. Crowd estimates in that era were usually just that, estimates, and they carried rhetorical weight. Saying hundreds didn't just mean between 200 and 900. It could function more loosely, like saying innumerable, or too many to count. On top of that, narratives evolve. A chronicle written 10 years after an event might say, many dozens, in an attempt to be honest about uncertainty. A compiler drawing on that chronicle a century later might decide to clarify that vague phrase with a neat round number that seems plausible. 200, 300, 400. Over time, that chosen number hardens, repeated from author to author until it gains an authority it never really earned. Modern historians, when they go back to the oldest available sources, tend to land on a cautious middle ground. The evidence strongly suggests that by the peak of the outbreak, there were more than a handful of dancers, more than just the 15 to 30 we see in the first week. References to crowds and citywide concern are hard to reconcile with tiny numbers. At the same time, the precise figures, 400, 500, rest on much shakier ground. They're plausible, but they're not firmly anchored in contemporary records. So when you hear hundreds of dancers, the honest answer is maybe. The lower end of that range is very possible. The The upper end is uncertain. What we can say responsibly is that the number was large enough to be socially disruptive and memorable, but not large enough to leave an unambiguous standardized count in official documents. The same pattern, solid core, fuzzy edges, applies to other parts of the story too. Take duration. City records and medical descriptions agree that the outbreak unfolded over weeks, not hours. We're looking at something like a month to a month and a half of recurring visible episodes. That much is well supported. But when later accounts talk about individuals dancing non-stop for days without sleep, never eating, never drinking, and only collapsing in death, we move into more speculative territory. The early physician's account does report extreme exhaustion, damaged feet, and people collapsing from fatigue. That is believable and consistent with what we know about the limits of the human body. But no contemporary document carefully records a tally of X people danced until they dropped dead on the spot. The famous image of people literally dancing to death in droves as a frequent and direct outcome comes largely from later elaboration. The same goes for geographic spread. Some modern tellings imply that dancing suddenly erupted all across the city, in every quarter at once, like a switch had been flipped. The older records paint a more localized picture. Clusters of dancers in particular streets and neighborhoods, spreading enough to become a citywide concern, but not turning the entire municipality into a non-stop hostile nightclub. So where is the line between what's historically sturdy and what's on shakier ground? On the sturdy side, you can place the existence of an unusual compulsive dancing outbreak in Strasbourg in 1518. The involvement of dozens of people at minimum, likely more by the peak. The persistence of the phenomenon over several weeks. The distress and exhaustion of the dancers, as reported by a physician and other near-contemporary observers. The reaction of the city council, consultations with experts, public measures, expenditures aimed at managing or resolving the problem. The perception among contemporaries that this was a crisis, not a minor curiosity. On the shaky side, you have precise numbers of participants beyond rough estimates. Exact death counts directly attributable to dancing itself. Detailed minute-by-minute timelines for individual dancers. Any suggestion that we know exactly who started the outbreak besides the conventional naming of Frau Trophäa, whose identity is itself only thinly documented. Clean, linear chains of causation, presented in later moralizing or medical narratives. The historical record also has big silent gaps. We don't have detailed testimonies from the dancers themselves. We know almost nothing about their personal backgrounds, their emotional states in the days before they started dancing, or what, if anything, they remembered afterward. We don't have hospital logs listing symptoms or mortality registers neatly marking cause of death dancing. Instead, we have other people speaking about them. Officials worried about order, clergy worried about sin and salvation, physicians worried about their own theoretical frameworks. All of those voices are valuable, but all are partial. Each group was describing the same phenomenon from its own angle, with its own priorities and blind spots. This is why modern scholars read the sources almost like layered palimpsests. The driest city notes anchor us in place and time. Strasbourg, July to September, decisions made, money spent. The near-contemporary chronicles add emotional and sensory colour, but must be sifted carefully for exaggeration. The later writers, who often give us the most gripping anecdotes, are treated with the greatest caution, because they sometimes cared less about fidelity to messy reality, and more about fitting the story into a pattern, divine punishment, medical oddity, human folly. From this triangulation, a picture emerges, a real outbreak in a real city with real suffering, and a story that, over 500 years, has been polished, stretched, and simplified until the edges of fact and legend almost touch. But those rough edges matter, because how we read the record shapes how we explain what happened. Was this a purely psychological phenomenon, a toxic exposure, a spiritual crisis expressed through bodies, a social event that got out of hand? To start answering those questions, we have to look not just at the dancers, but at what Strasbourg's leaders actually did in response. What choices they made reveals a great deal about what they thought was happening, and about the world of fear, faith, and fragile bodies in which this strange plague unfolded. When the council finally moved from alarmed observation to concrete action, they did what pre-modern governments usually did in a crisis. They reached for the intellectual tools they had. That meant physicians, theologians, and a lot of inherited assumptions about how bodies and souls worked. The surviving records suggest that, at least initially, the outbreak was framed less as a supernatural curse and more as a medical and moral imbalance. The first official responses point toward what we might call a humoral diagnosis. Within the Galenic medical tradition that dominated Strasbourg in 1518, intense, uncontrolled movement could be interpreted as an excess of blood or heat, or as a form of melancholic disturbance driving people into frenzied behaviour. The body, in this view, wasn't a sealed-off biological machine. It was a porous system influenced by stars, food, emotions, and spiritual forces, all at once. So the council summoned physicians and asked, "What is this, and what do we do?" The answer they got, at least according to near-contemporary reports, was not lock them up or force them to stop. It was something much stranger to modern ears. Let them dance it out. Some medical writers claim that Strasbourg's doctors advised the council that the dancers were suffering from overheated blood that needed to be literally worked out of their systems. Stopping them by force in this logic would be dangerous. The pressure would remain inside, turning into worse illness or even sudden death. The safest course was to let the afflicted continue until the imbalance burned itself out. Viewed from 21st century medicine, that sounds catastrophic. Viewed from 1518, it was consistent with a whole web of beliefs. If you think of emotions and fluids as things that must flow, must find an outlet, then a convulsive, compulsive dance looks like a symptom that should be allowed to complete its arc, not something to be abruptly interrupted. The city council, weighing this advice against the disruption in the streets, tried to compromise. They would not simply disperse the dancers and send them home, but they also could not have them clogging central streets indefinitely, frightening residents and interfering with commerce. So one of their first recorded strategies was spatial management. Move the dancers. Council minutes and later summaries converge on the idea that authorities arranged to have dancers escorted out of certain highly visible urban locations into more controlled spaces. In some tellings, they were moved from narrow, crowded streets to larger squares or halls. In others, the emphasis falls on removing them from the heart of the city and concentrating them in a specific quarter where the activity could be supervised. Either way, the underlying impulse is recognizable. This was crowd control as much as it was therapy. By concentrating the afflicted, the council could keep a closer eye on them, reduce interference with daily life, and present the appearance of order. At the same time, they were following the physician's recommendation not to suppress the movement itself. Then comes the detail that strikes most modern readers as almost surreal. The council hired musicians. We know from payment records that city funds were spent on pipers and drummers. Chronicles and later reports agree on the basic scenario. Professional musicians were brought in to play for the dancers, sometimes on specially constructed stages or in designated areas. There are hints of platforms being erected to elevate the players, of wooden structures where the spectacle could unfold in an organized way. To us, this looks like pouring gasoline on a fire. To the people designing the response, it may have looked like harnessing chaos. If medicine told you that the disease needed to run its course through movement, then having music to regulate that movement made sense. Rhythm, after all, organizes motion. With musicians, you can give the dancers something to synchronize to. You can, in principle, guide their frenzies into patterns, make it less of a wild, random thrashing, and more of a contained, predictable activity. There is also a deeper cultural layer. In late medieval and early modern Europe, dancing itself was not inherently pathological. It was a social activity, a ritualized form of bodily expression that could be celebratory, courtly, or penitential. Religious processions sometimes incorporated rhythmic movements. Certain saints' cults involve specific body practices, turning an uncontrolled outbreak of movement into something that looked more like a sanctioned quasi-ritual event may have felt like a way to reinsert meaning and structure where there had been only terror. The hired musicians and organized spaces, then, weren't just about entertainment. They were attempts at therapeutic ritualization. The council and their advisors were trying to turn raw, frightening bodily compulsion into a kind of guided catharsis, under the watchful eye of both civic and religious authorities. There is a reasonable chance that they also hoped this would limit spread. If the dancers were gathered together in one location, with an official program of music, perhaps onlookers would interpret the event as a specific contained rite, rather than as a contagious, free-floating horror. The line between controlled spectacle and uncontrolled epidemic is thin in a world where behaviour and belief feed each other. But as the weeks wore on, it seems this strategy did not produce the quick resolution the council had hoped for. People continued to collapse from exhaustion. New dancers may have joined, if not in great waves, then at least enough to keep the phenomenon painfully visible. The idea that music and space could cure the affliction by organising it began to look less like wisdom and more like complicity. At that point, the logic of the response shifted. If dancing it out wasn't working, perhaps this wasn't primarily a humoral disease after all. Perhaps this was a spiritual crisis, a matter for saints rather than surgeons. In late medieval Alsace, one saint in particular loomed large over strange movement disorders, Saint Vitus. Across Central Europe, he was associated with convulsive illnesses, chorias, and what people sometimes called Saint Vitus's dance. To be seized by uncontrollable motion could be interpreted as falling under his influence or his displeasure. The cure, in that framework, was not only physical rest or altered diet, but pilgrimage and ritual appeasement. The Strasbourg Council, as best we can tell from the sources, eventually embraced this line of thinking. They arranged for many of the afflicted to be transported to a shrine of Saint Vitus, often identified as being near Saverne, in the hills not far from the city. The dancers, or at least a significant subset of them, were led or carried there, sometimes with attendants, sometimes with instructions for specific rites. This marked a clear pivot in strategy, from managing the plague within the city to exporting it, both literally and spiritually. It's easy to see the practical benefits. Moving the dancers out of Strasbourg reduced the immediate disruption. It gave the council a way to be seen as decisive. They had taken action, placed the problem under the care of a well-known saint, and aligned themselves with broader religious traditions rather than improvising alone. But there was also a kind of theological tidiness. If this affliction was connected to St. Vitus, then bringing the sufferers to his shrine wrapped the crisis in a narrative of sin, penance, and intercession. They were no longer just random citizens whose bodies had rebelled. They were pilgrims. Their suffering was absorbed into a framework of meaning that people in 1518 could understand. We have hints that once at the shrine, the dancers went through prescribed rituals, offerings, prayers, perhaps the wearing of small red crosses on their clothing or shoes, sometimes mentioned in later accounts as protective tokens. Whether all of this happened in exactly the way later writers describe is uncertain. The core idea, however, that the afflicted were placed under a saint's care and asked to perform religious acts, meshes well with what we know of similar cases in the region. What stands out in this progression, from street management to music to pilgrimage, is not random flailing, but a consistent attempt to map the unknown onto existing categories of action. First, the council listened to doctors and treated excessive dancing as a bodily imbalance that had to be expressed and resolved. When that failed, they leaned harder on religious specialists and treated it as a spiritual burden that had to be carried to a holy site. Along the way, they tried to preserve public order, protect economic life, and maintain their own legitimacy. They were improvising, but they were improvising within a tight set of intellectual and institutional constraints. To modern observers, some of these choices look tragically counterproductive. Hiring musicians might have amplified the spectacle, drawing more attention to the dancers and perhaps even encouraging suggestible bystanders to join. Sending large groups on pilgrimage might have reinforced the idea that this was a special, quasi-holy affliction, worth imitating or fearing. Relocating dancers could have helped spread any underlying illness if there was one. But hindsight is easy. The councillors of Strasbourg were dealing with something that felt new and frightening, using tools forged in a world where the boundary between body and belief was much thinner. From their perspective, they were not being absurd. They were being methodical. They consulted experts. They spent money. They shifted tactics when initial measures didn't work. They folded the crisis into frameworks, medical, religious, administrative, that had guided responses to other disasters, plagues, famines, processions of penitents. Each step told a story about what they thought this was. And those stories matter, because whether you call this a dance plague, a psychogenic outbreak, a ritual gone wrong, or a mass poisoning, you can't explain it in isolation from how authorities responded. Their actions didn't just reflect the crisis, they helped shape it. The next question is whether those actions made the suffering worse, whether people really danced themselves to death, or whether that grim phrase is another product of time and retelling. So did they? Did people in Strasbourg actually dance themselves to death? If you read a lot of popular summaries, the answer sounds straightforward. They'll tell you that dozens of people collapsed dead in the streets, their hearts bursting, their bodies giving out after days without rest. Some versions even throw out specific numbers: 50 dead, 100 dead, 400 dead. The image is cinematic, almost tailor-made for a headline. A city turned into one big lethal rave. The problem is that when you go looking for those numbers in the documents closest to 1518, they melt. Our best near-contemporary sources, city council notes, sermons, medical treatises, a few chronicles written within a generation, do describe people collapsing. They describe exhaustion, injuries, suffering that lasted not hours but days or even weeks. But they don't calmly tally up corpses in the way later storytellers like to imagine. They don't give us a neat ledger. On such and such a day, 10 dancers expired. Instead, we get language of fear and extremity. We hear about people who could not cease until they fell, people brought low by their bodies, people whose lives were clearly at risk. In some later retellings based on earlier notes, writers say that many died or that not a few perished. That's suggestive, but it's not a clean statistical report. So historians are left doing an uncomfortable two-step. On one beat, we have to admit that the specific death counts you see repeated in modern books, especially nice round figures, are almost certainly exaggerations or guesses layered on centuries after the event. On the other beat, we have to take seriously the medical reality that, even without precise numbers, some of these people very likely did die from what happened to them. To get a grip on that, it helps to step away from the rhetoric and think about bodies under stress. What happens if you make a human being move almost continuously for days in the brutal heat of a European summer without adequate food, water, or sleep? Modern medicine has plenty to say about that, and none of it's reassuring. First, simple exhaustion isn't simple. Prolonged intense exertion tears muscle fibers, breaks down proteins, and floods the bloodstream with their byproducts. In extreme cases, this can turn into a condition called rhabdomyolysis, where damaged muscle tissue releases so much material into the blood that the kidneys choke trying to filter it. Left untreated, that alone can kill you. Then there's heat. Even moderate dancing generates a lot of internal heat. Do it in July, in heavy late medieval clothing, in a crowded square or hall, with limited shade and poor air circulation, and your body is fighting hard just to keep your core temperature down. Hypothermia, overheating, stresses every organ system. It thickens the blood, strains the heart, and can trigger a cascade of failures. Your cardiovascular system is the next weak link. Sustained high heart rates, especially in people who are malnourished, anemic, or already carrying undiagnosed heart disease, increase the risk of arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats that can tip into sudden cardiac arrest. Today we occasionally hear about athletes or partygoers who collapse and die after pushing themselves past a limit they didn't know they had. In 1518, with no concept of electrolytes, no IV fluids, no defibrillators, that line was much easier to cross and much harder to come back from. Add to that the risk of stroke. Dehydration and overheating thicken the blood. Combine that with sudden spikes in blood pressure from frantic movement and emotional stress, and the chances of a clot forming or a weak vessel rupturing go up. A person could be moving one moment and lying half paralyzed the next, and in a pre-modern context, that might easily be described as someone struck down by the dance, whether or not the mechanism was appreciated. Finally, we can't ignore the downstream effects. Even if the immediate crisis didn't kill you on the spot, a week or two of intense overexertion could leave people immune-compromised, with damaged muscles, injured joints, and raw, blistered feet. In an era of frequent infections and limited care, the line between survived the dance and died a month later of something triggered by it gets blurry. Chronic heart failure, kidney failure, or lung infections in the wake of an ordeal are all plausible. So from a strictly medical standpoint, the idea that no one died as a result of the Strasbourg outbreak is almost as implausible as the idea that hundreds did. When you gather dozens, maybe hundreds, of already stressed, underfed, anxious people, and push many of them into nearly continuous exertion, some portion of that group is going to cross the threshold from survivable stress into irreversible damage. Where things get tricky is mapping that medical plausibility onto the actual record. When later writers say that many died, are they reflecting a genuine local memory of multiple funerals? Or are they drawing on a dramatic trope, The way modern journalists might say, scores died without counting each one, medieval chroniclers loved moralizing tales. Turning the dancing plague into an example of divine punishment or human folly naturally encouraged them to sharpen its horrors. The bigger and more lethal the story, the more useful it became as a sermon illustration, a cautionary tale about sin, excess, or disbelief. Once you treat it that way, the precise boundary between some died and many died starts to slide. You can see that sliding in the way the story grows over time. 16th and 17th century summaries sometimes speak vaguely of deaths. By the time you reach modern popular histories and clickbait articles, precise figures appear where the sources are silent. At least 15 people a day dropped dead. As many as 400 died. Those numbers are impressive, but they tend to point back not to archival documents, but to each other. Most cautious historians now talk about the death toll as genuinely unknown. Some think that only a small handful of people, perhaps those already frail, died as a direct result. Others allow for several dozen, spread over the weeks of the outbreak and its aftermath. A few remain open to higher estimates but admit that we lack hard evidence to justify them. So where does that leave the phrase, dance to death? It probably shouldn't be taken as a literal technical description, like something on a death certificate. It's more like a compressed expression of what people saw and feared. To onlookers, it must have looked as if the dance itself was the killing force. People moved until they fell. Some never fully recovered. Others were carried away to shrines or sick beds and might not have been seen again. In a community already straining under hunger and disease, those disappearances would easily fold into the memory of a single, lethal episode. At the same time, to minimize the death toll because we lack a neat number risks missing something important. Even if, hypothetically, every single dancer survived in the strict biological sense, what happened to them was not some quirky, amusing footnote. The physical pain, the terrified conviction of being trapped in an involuntary movement, the social consequences of being marked as afflicted, all of that was real harm. The very fact that authorities worried about people dropping dead if they were stopped too suddenly tells us they believed the edge of death was close. Whether they were right about the mechanism isn't the point. Their fear speaks to how severe the symptoms looked. So when we ask, did people really dance to death? The most honest answer is layered. Yes, sustained, uncontrolled dancing in the heat, without rest or proper nutrition, can absolutely kill through exhaustion, heart failure, stroke, or secondary complications. It was medically plausible in 1518, and it would be today. Yes, some people probably did die as a result of the Strasbourg outbreak, whether in the streets, on the way to shrines, or in the weeks that followed as their overtaxed bodies failed. No, we don't have solid contemporary figures to back up the big dramatic death tolls you often see repeated. Much of the numerical certainty is storytelling, not data, and regardless of the body count, the suffering was extreme enough that people at the time reached for the most powerful frameworks they had, sin, saints, humours, pilgrimage, to make sense of it. Once you see that, another question comes into focus. Why were these bodies so close to the edge in the first place? What kind of world leaves people one prolonged dance away from collapse? To answer that, you have to step back from the streets of Strasbourg and look at the wider landscape its citizens were living in. A landscape of hunger, fear, and grinding stress that primed both bodies and minds for a crisis like this. To get into that landscape, you have to strip away the modern postcard version of Alsace, vineyards, half-timbered houses, tourists with cameras, and remember what life looked like in the decades around 1518 if you were not rich, not powerful, and not in control of very much at all. Start with food. In the early 1500s, the Rhine Valley was not some idyllic breadbasket reliably churning out surplus. It was a patchwork of tiny fields and fragile harvests, at the mercy of weather, pests, and politics. When crops were good, most people still lived close to the edge. When crops were bad, that edge vanished. The years leading up to the dancing outbreak were rough. Central Europe had been flirting with what historians call the Little Ice Age, a long period of cooler, more erratic weather. Harvests in the 1510s were repeatedly hit by late frosts, heavy rains, and disease in the grain. In many regions, 1516 and 1517 in particular saw poor yields and soaring prices. For anyone living hand-to-mouth, a bad harvest doesn't show up as an interesting statistic. It shows up as the loaf is smaller, the flour is coarser, the beer is watered down, the landlord still demands the same rent, the tax collector still knocks, the tithe still has to be paid to the church. Something has to give, and it's usually the bodies of the poor. In Strasbourg, city records from this period talk about bread shortages, about grain being imported at high cost, about attempts to regulate prices because people were getting desperate. When the authorities are worried enough to intervene in the market, you know the pressure has already been building for a while. Famine, in this world, wasn't always spectacular. No endless lines of skeletal figures on the road. It was more often chronic undernourishment, children a little shorter than they might have been, adults with less muscle and more illness, people who could work, but not as long, not as hard, not without paying a bigger physiological price. Now layer economic strain on top of that. Strasbourg was a prosperous trading city by medieval standards, but prosperous city in the 1500s doesn't mean a rising tide lifting all boats. It means a small merchant elite doing very well, guild masters and established craftsmen doing okay most of the time, and a mass of day labourers, servants, widows and migrants surviving on whatever they could scrape together. The early 16th century was a time of what we might call proto-capitalist tension. Markets were expanding, money was flowing, but security was fragile. If you were a weaver and cloth prices dipped, if you were a carter and trade slowed because of war or bad roads, if you were a field hand and your employer cut back on hired labour after a bad harvest, your income disappeared almost overnight. There was no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no safety net beyond family and whatever charity the church or the city was willing to offer. We have records of people in Strasbourg pawning their clothes, tools, even their bedding to buy grain. That's not just economic data, that's a measure of how thin the margin was. When your backup plan is sell the coat that keeps you warm, you're living in a constant grinding state of low-level emergency. And all this was happening in a wider context of instability. The Holy Roman Empire, which Strasbourg was part of, was entering one of its most turbulent centuries. There were peasant uprisings brewing in the countryside, resentment against feudal dues, against taxes, against the sense that the powerful were squeezing the last drops out of people who had nothing left to give. Just 8 years after the Dancing Plague, those resentments would explode in the German Peasants' War, one of the largest mass uprisings in European history. Even before open revolt, rumours and fear travelled quickly. People heard about villages burned, rebels hanged, mercenaries on the move. The sense that violence might be coming, that the world was in moral and social crisis, hung in the air. At the same time, the religious landscape was fracturing. In 1517, just a year before the outbreak, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, setting off a wave of theological conflict that would echo across Europe. Strasbourg itself would become an important Reformation city, but in 1518 that future wasn't clear yet. What was clear was confusion, sermons against corruption, criticisms of indulgences, mutterings about false priests, counter-sermons defending tradition. For ordinary believers, this wasn't an abstract doctrinal game. It raised visceral questions. Are our rituals still effective? Is God angry at us? Are the saints still listening? If the official channels to the divine are corrupted, where do you go for help? So picture an average townsman or townswoman in Strasbourg around that time. Food is more expensive than it used to be. Work feels more precarious. Taxes and dues never seem to go down. There are whispers of revolt. There are sermons about sin and judgment. News of strange diseases and omens travel along the same roads as merchants and soldiers. Plague outbreaks still flare up without warning in nearby regions. You've seen neighbours sicken and die. You know what it is to bury children. This is not a relaxed baseline. This is a nervous system tuned to threat. Modern science would call this chronic stress, not the short, sharp spike you get when you almost step in front of a car and jump back, but a long, drawn-out activation of the body's emergency systems. Your stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, aren't meant to stay elevated for months on end. When they do, they start to reshape you from the inside. Chronic stress suppresses the immune system, making you more vulnerable to infections. It disrupts sleep, which in turn worsens anxiety and physical health. It raises blood pressure, strains the heart, messes with digestion. It's linked to headaches, muscle pain, and a host of unexplained bodily sensations that feel very real, even if a doctor can't see them. It also affects the brain. Under long-term stress, the parts of your brain that detect danger become more sensitive. You're more likely to interpret ambiguous signals as threatening. You become hyper-attuned to what's happening around you. A cough in the next room, a strange rash on your arm, the way your neighbour twitches when they pray. At the same time, your capacity for calm, reflective thinking gets eroded. You're tired, you're on edge, your sleep is bad, your diet is poor, your world feels unstable. In that state, bodies don't just suffer individually, they begin to respond collectively. Humans are social animals. Our nervous systems are wired to pick up on the emotional states of those around us. When one person in a group is anxious, others often become anxious too, even if they can't say exactly why. Fear spreads. So does relief, laughter, and, crucially for something like the dancing plague, strange behavior that seems to offer a way to express or manage overwhelming feelings. Psychologists talk about things like conversion disorders and somatic symptom disorders, where emotional stress gets translated into physical symptoms, seizures, paralysis, blindness, pain, without an underlying physical injury. These aren't faked. The sufferers aren't acting. Their brains are doing something real, but they're doing it through the body. Now imagine a whole community where stress is the background noise of life. Food is insecure, money is tight. Political and religious authority feels shaky. Disease is always a threat. You don't have the language of psychiatry or neurology. You have saints and demons, humours and miasmas, sin and salvation. In that world, when one person's distress erupts in a bizarre, compelling form, uncontrollable dancing, say, it doesn't just happen to them in isolation. It happens on a stage already crowded with fear. People watch, some are horrified, some are fascinated, some recognise, at a level they can't articulate, an echo of their own inner turmoil. The idea that a holy or unholy force might seize your body and make it move until you collapse doesn't feel like a speculative horror story. It feels like an extension of what life already does to you, drives you, tires you, uses you up. Once you see it that way, the leap from individual symptom to group outbreak becomes easier to understand. If stress can reshape one person's body, why wouldn't shared stress in a tightly knit, deeply religious community be capable of producing shared, coordinated symptoms? This is the basic intuition behind what many modern historians call a stress-triggered theory of the Strasbourg dancing plague. It doesn't pin everything on a single cause, a mouldy loaf, a secret cult, a poisoning plot. Instead, it looks at the long-term pressures bearing down on the city, and asks how those pressures might have primed people for an episode of collective suffering. In this view, famine and near-famine conditions weakened bodies. Economic and political instability eroded any sense of control. Religious conflict muddied the waters of meaning and comfort. These weren't background details, they were the emotional climate. When Frau Troffea began to dance and couldn't stop, she wasn't just a woman with a mysterious affliction. She was a match dropped into a room full of dry tinder. Once we shift our attention from the dance itself to the landscape it grew out of, it becomes easier to see why so many scholars have been attracted to explanations that centre stress, fear, and belief. They're not as flashy as a psychedelic fungus, but they fit what we know about how humans respond individually and collectively when life feels like an unending emergency. And in Strasbourg in 1518, there was one more powerful ingredient flowing through that stressed-out landscape: the conviction that saints and supernatural forces could reach into your body and make it move, or stop, or suffer. To understand how that belief shaped what happened, we have to meet one particular holy figure whose name would become forever linked to the dancing disease. In the late Middle Ages, the Rhine Valley was thick with saints, not just in the sense of statues in churches or names on feast days, but as active presences in people's mental maps of the world. Every disease, every fear, every kind of misfortune had its heavenly specialist. If your child was sick, if your cow wouldn't calve, if your ship was about to sail, if your crops were failing, there was a saint whose job description covered that territory. They weren't abstract concepts. They were more like powerful patrons at a cosmic court. You could petition them, bargain with them, make offerings to them. They could be offended. They could be appeased. They could intervene directly in your body and your life. The Rhine region between Switzerland and the Low Countries was crisscrossed with pilgrimage routes. People walked for days, sometimes weeks, to visit shrines where a particular saint was said to have worked miracles. You went there with a specific problem in mind. You brought wax votives shaped like legs, arms, eyes, hearts, little anatomical prayers. You touched relics, a bone, a scrap of cloth, a fragment of skull, believed to be saturated with the saint's power. In that universe, illness wasn't just a biological event. It was moral and spiritual. A strange seizure, a convulsion, a paralysis, a hallucination. These weren't just random misfires of nerves and brain cells. They were signs. They meant something. And for several centuries in Western Europe, one saint in particular became linked to a very specific, very dramatic kind of suffering, involuntary movement. Saint Vitus. By the time the Strasbourg dancing plague occurred, Vitus already had a reputation as the patron saint of what people called choreas, jerking and twisting movements of the body. Later medical textbooks would coin terms like chorea sancti viti, Saint Vitus's dance, to describe certain neurological disorders. But in popular belief, the association ran deeper than a label. Vitus was the figure you turned to if you were afraid of being seized by an uncontrollable dance, or if you already were. His legend, like most saints' stories, is a tangle of martyrdom, courage, and miracle. According to tradition, he was a young Christian in the Roman Empire who refused to renounce his faith, endured torture, and died heroically. But over time, medieval storytellers added to the tale. Vitus could cure demonic possession. Vitus protected against nervous disorders. Vitus was particularly concerned with those whose bodies moved without their consent. By the 15th century, this had turned into a very practical piece of folk theology along the Rhine. If you were struck by a kind of frenzied dancing, or if you wanted to make sure you never were, you went, physically or spiritually, to St. Vitus. There are records from the decades before 1518 of people in this region making organised processions to chapels dedicated to him, especially around his feast day in June. Sometimes these processions themselves involved rhythmic movement, almost like a ritualised, controlled version of the very thing people feared. You sang, you walked, you swayed, you maybe even skipped in time. You performed the body's vulnerability in a supervised sacred context, hoping that by doing so you would keep the real, chaotic affliction at bay. That's an important piece of the mental backdrop. When Frau Trophäa began to dance in Strasbourg, the people around her didn't have to invent an explanation from scratch. They had a ready-made script. This looks like the curse of St. Vitus, or depending on who you asked, this looks like a demon that only St. Vitus can cast out. Earlier sources from the wider region talk about plagues of St. Vitus, groups of people who, often in the heat of summer, suddenly began to leap, spin or run in convulsive patterns until they collapsed. Chroniclers and preachers framed these events as both punishment and plea, punishment for sins, plea for deliverance. Victims would be urged or forced to go on pilgrimage to a Vitus shrine, sometimes escorted by clerics and musicians, in the hope that the saint would either forgive them or complete whatever mystic process had seized them. Notice how the belief system shapes both perception and response. If you're primed to see uncontrolled movement as a spiritual affliction tied to a particular saint, then the first person who starts to twitch or dance doesn't just look odd. They look like the opening act of a known story. You already know the plot beats. More people might be struck. The only cure is to invoke the saint. The way to do that is pilgrimage, prayer, ritual. And once an episode starts to be labelled in that way, it actually nudges bodies and minds to cooperate with the label. Modern psychologists talk about expectation effects, how what you think is happening can steer what your nervous system does. Placebos work this way, so do some side effects. If you're told a pill might cause headaches, you're more likely to get a headache, even if the pill is inert. In a medieval religious culture, saints and demons were the vocabulary of expectation. If you had heard stories your whole life of people taken by Vitus, dancing themselves into exhaustion in a kind of trance, and then you found yourself under crushing stress, underfed, sleep-deprived, anxious, and suddenly your legs wouldn't stop moving, what else could it be? The narrative rushes in to interpret the sensation, and interpretation in turn amplifies the sensation. Instead of thinking, my muscles are tight, my heart is racing, I feel shaky, you think, it's happening, I've been seized. That thought doesn't calm the body, it pours fuel on the fire. The communal nature of belief compounds this. You're not the only one with the story in your head. Your neighbours, your family, your priest, the city officials, everyone in Strasbourg knew the reputation of Saint Vitus. They'd heard tales of dancing plagues in nearby cities like Aachen and Cologne in earlier centuries. They'd seen or taken part in Vitus processions themselves. So when they watched you dance, they didn't see random flailing. They saw the script unfolding. That collective recognition does two things at once. First, it validates the experience. You're not told, stop pretending. You're told, yes, this is real. This is what happens when Vitus strikes. That recognition can paradoxically make symptoms more intense, because your mind no longer treats them as something you can easily override. They are bigger than you. They are a sign of a higher power. Fighting back might even feel like resisting God's will. Second, it dictates a culturally appropriate response. Authorities in Strasbourg didn't, at least initially, interpret the outbreak as a purely medical or moral failing. They saw it as a spiritual crisis with a known remedy. So they organised exactly the kind of thing Rhine Valley people had been doing for generations, a quasi-pilgrimage. The dancers were eventually taken to a shrine of Saint Vitus at a nearby chapel. They were given special shoes, consecrated on his altar, and placed under his care. In other words, the city unwittingly played along with the logic of the affliction. From a modern perspective, this makes sense. If you think the cure is devotional, you double down on devotion. From the perspective of a stress-primed, belief-saturated nervous system, it also means the entire social apparatus confirms that the dance is the work of a saint, that it deserves to continue until he chooses to end it. It's easy, looking back, to see this as superstition making things worse. But to the people involved, it was a coherent attempt to manage terror with the tools they had. They weren't just watching a bizarre illness. They were participating in a ritual drama where bodies, beliefs, and institutions were all entangled. And that entanglement is crucial for understanding how the outbreak could sustain itself. If the only framework you have says, these movements are sacred suffering, this is how St. Vitus punishes or purifies. The only way out is through, then every additional dancer doesn't undermine the story, they reinforce it. Each new body seized becomes another piece of proof that the plague is real, that the saint is active, that the community is under judgment or in need of mercy. The result is a feedback loop. Stress and hardship make bizarre symptoms more likely. The religious framework interprets those symptoms in a vivid, emotionally charged way. Social and ritual responses, pilgrimages, processions, special masses, legitimize and dramatize the affliction. That, in turn, makes more people susceptible to experiencing similar symptoms, whether through fear, suggestion, or some deeper psychophysiological process. By the time the Strasbourg authorities realized that their initial religious strategies might be fueling the fire instead of quenching it, dozens of people were already caught up in the dance. The power of belief had done what belief often does in human history. It had transformed private anguish into a public spectacle. To see how this transformation might work in terms that modern science recognizes, nervous systems, mirror neurons, psychogenic illness, we have to step, at least temporarily, out of the world of saints and into the world of psychology. Psychologists today have a term for outbreaks where symptoms spread through a group without a clear physical cause that can explain every case. They call it mass psychogenic illness, sometimes mass hysteria, sometimes conversion disorder on a social scale. None of those names is very flattering and all of them are easy to misunderstand. If you picture a bunch of people just pretending to be sick, or getting carried away because they're gullible, you're thinking of something else. Mass psychogenic illness isn't about faking. It's about the way human brains and bodies, under stress in groups, can generate very real symptoms that are contagious in a way viruses aren't. The basic idea looks like this. Take a community under intense pressure. Fear, uncertainty, hunger, social conflict, some mix of things that crank everyone's nervous system into a higher gear. Add a trigger. One person develops a strange symptom that doesn't fit any familiar everyday illness. They faint, they shake, they laugh uncontrollably, they feel insects crawling on their skin, or their legs just won't stop moving. Everyone around them watches, tries to make sense of it, and reaches for whatever explanation their culture hands them. Demons, toxins, radiation, a curse, Saint Vitus. Now add suggestion. If you see someone nearby, especially someone like you, someone in your social circle, collapse with a terrifying symptom, your body pays attention. Your heart rate jumps, your muscles tense. Your mind starts checking, is this happening to me too? The more you monitor your own sensations, the more you notice every twitch, every flutter, every ache that would normally just pass through the background. Under the right conditions, that vigilance can tip over into imitation without anyone consciously deciding to copy anything. Your own legs feel weak, your breathing turns shallow, your hands tremble. You might not think, I'm going to join them. You think, oh no, it's starting. That shift from neutral to it's starting is the key moment. In mass psychogenic illness, belief and fear push the body into a kind of runaway feedback loop. Stress makes symptoms more likely. Symptoms confirm the fearful explanation. The explanation increases stress. And every new person who develops the symptoms makes the explanation seem more obviously correct to everyone else. This is why psychogenic doesn't mean imaginary. If you're nauseated because you're terrified, the nausea is not fake. If your legs give out because your nervous system is in full crisis mode, you will hit the ground just as hard as if you'd been poisoned. Muscle spasms, paralysis, seizures, pain, these can all be generated or amplified by the brain. Your conscious mind doesn't have to consent. You can be utterly convinced that something purely physical has struck you down. What makes it mass isn't the number, it's the pattern. Case studies from the last century show remarkably similar scenes in very different cultures. A factory where, after one worker faints from a strange smell, dozens collapse over the next hours, convinced there's a gas leak, even though no toxin is found. A school where, after one student has a seizure, a wave of girls start twitching and crying and losing consciousness over days or weeks. A village where people begin laughing uncontrollably, sometimes for hours at a time, after an initial incident no one can quite reconstruct. In each of these events, epidemiologists look for the usual suspects: contaminated food, chemical exposure, an infectious pathogen. When no consistent physical cause appears, and when the spread follows social lines more than biological ones, friends of friends, co-workers in the same room, people who heard the story but were never in contact with the supposed source, they start thinking in psychogenic terms. Mass psychogenic illness tends to move along networks of attention and relationship, not along plumbing or wind currents. It favours groups that share similar stresses and beliefs. It often starts abruptly and fades just as quickly when attention shifts, authority figures reframe the event, or the social pressure is relieved. Look back at Strasbourg through that lens, and certain features line up almost too neatly. The outbreak appears to have begun with a single highly visible individual, Frau Trophäa, in a public street, under the eyes of her neighbours. Her behaviour was alarming, repetitive, and hard to classify within ordinary everyday experience. People watching already had a mental category for it, Saint Vitus's curse, and that category came with a story. This can spread, this can seize you, this can drive you to dance until you drop. The city was under heavy shared stress. Famine, disease, heat, economic anxiety, religious tension. Everyone's baseline was already elevated. Sleep was poor, diets were bad, tempers were short. Bodies under those conditions are primed to tip from strange feeling to catastrophic episode very quickly. The dance then spread not randomly, but through the social fabric. It didn't hit every district of Strasbourg evenly. It clustered around where the dancing was seen, where the story was hottest, where people were talking about it constantly and expecting it. In other words, it tracked conversation and attention more than it tracked, say, the grain supply system or the river. Even the city's response fits common MPI patterns. Modern outbreaks often calm down when authorities quietly separate those affected, avoid dramatizing the event, and gently reframe what's happening. Strasbourg did almost the opposite. They collected the dancers together, gave them a stage and musicians, and publicly declared that a powerful supernatural force was at work. Later, they processed them in a group to a shrine, reinforcing the sense that this was a single, communal affliction with a shared spiritual cause. From a 21st century diagnostic playbook, that's basically a recipe for amplification. So mass psychogenic illness explains a lot. It explains why the outbreak could spread without needing a poison or pathogen to march from body to body. It explains why it seemed to follow awareness and belief, why it erupted in a high-stress environment, and why it eventually burned out when authorities shifted strategies and the social script lost momentum. But it doesn't neatly answer everything. For one thing, our sources are thin and biased. Chroniclers might have exaggerated numbers, durations, and deaths. They might have conflated different kinds of movement, genuine neurological disease, epileptic seizures, ecstatic religious behavior, and psychogenic symptoms under a single dramatic label. Second, even in modern mass psychogenic events, not everyone's symptoms have the same origin. In a school outbreak, some students may be having stress-induced fainting spells. One may actually have epilepsy. Another might seize the moment to fake illness for complicated personal reasons. The category is messy. Strasbourg, with its mix of starvation, disease, belief, and spectacle, was almost certainly messy too. And finally, no one has ever observed a modern case that looks exactly like a medieval dancing plague. Hundreds of people, moving in public for weeks on end. The psychological mechanism is plausible, but the historical scale is hard to test. So mass psychogenic illness gives us a powerful framework, not a full script. It shifts the focus from demons and saints to nervous systems and social contagion. It lets us see how belief can get under the skin, how one person's terror can ripple through a crowd and reshape other people's bodies. But it still leaves open a nagging question. If no invisible germ was passing from dancer to dancer, could there have been something else? Something in the bread, the water, the environment, helping to push those primed, fragile nervous systems over the edge? To explore that possibility, we have to look at a very different suspect, a toxic fungus hiding in the region's food supply. The fungus is called ergot, and on its own it doesn't look like the stuff of legends. On a stalk of rye, it appears as dark, hardened little growths where the grain kernels should be. You don't see swirling colours or hear ominous music when you look at it. It just looks like spoiled grain. But inside those small black nubs is a chemical arsenal. Ergot produces alkaloids, compounds that, in the right dose, can constrict blood vessels, trigger violent muscle spasms, cause burning pain in the limbs, distort vision, generate terrifying hallucinations, and push the mind into states that feel very much like madness or religious ecstasy. In high doses, it can kill. Medieval people didn't know the word ergot, but they knew the syndrome. When large amounts of contaminated rye were ground into flour and baked into bread, entire communities could be affected. In German-speaking regions, one classic form of ergot poisoning was called Heiliges Feuer, or Holy Fire, later St. Anthony's Fire. Victims might feel their hands and feet burning as if plunged into coals. Fingers and toes could turn black, shrivel, and even fall off as blood flow was choked off. Others experienced convulsions and bizarre, uncontrolled movements. Some screamed that demons were tormenting them. Some saw visions of saints, angels, or hellfire. Some slipped into coma and never woke up. If all of that is making a certain American counterculture drug come to mind, that's not an accident. The first synthesis of LSD in the 20th century was made from ergot compounds, the molecule that fueled psychedelic experiments, CIA projects, and 1960s art scenes has its roots in the same fungus that sometimes poisoned medieval peasants. So when modern historians and doctors read about a hot summer, poor harvests, starving people living on cheap rye bread, and then suddenly crowds of people thrashing and dancing and crying in the streets, ergot practically raises its own hand. Ergotism, they argue, could make people feel like their bodies were on fire. The constricted vessels and muscle spasms could drive them to move constantly, trying to relieve agony that never really goes away. Hallucinations could fill in the rest. Visions of saints, demons, curses, whatever the local religious imagination was primed to supply. In that state, stumbling, flailing, and dancing might blur together. On paper, the match seems tempting. Contaminated grain would offer a straightforward physical explanation. No need for mass psychology, saints, or curses. Just bad bread. A fungus in the rye pushes nervous systems into overdrive, and already stressed people spin out into chaos. But when you start comparing actual ergotism to what we know about Strasbourg in 1518, the fit becomes less comfortable. For one thing, ergot poisoning tends to be ugly in very specific ways. The convulsive form can cause twitching, jerks, seizures, and restless movement, yes, but it also brings vomiting, severe headache, drooling, and episodes of outright collapse. People don't just keep prancing. They fall over. They become incoherent. They suffer. The gangrenous form is even less dance-friendly. It damages limbs so badly that walking can become impossible. People lose sensation, then tissue, limbs rot. The primary image from those outbreaks is not crowds dancing. It's people begging for relief from burning pain and watching their hands and feet die. And there's another problem. Ergot doesn't usually pick and choose individuals in a neat line of social contagion. If the bread supply is contaminated, everyone eating that bread is at risk. You'd expect illness to appear more or less simultaneously among those who share the grain, not to ripple outward from one highly visible woman to onlookers over days and weeks. In Strasbourg, the pattern looks more like a social wave than a foodborne one. The dancers clustered around where Frau Trophäa started and where the spectacle was most intense. We don't hear about parallel outbreaks in nearby villages that shared the same grain, or a sudden spike in dead livestock from ergot-tainted feed. Things we might expect if the crop itself were badly infested. There's also the question of what the chroniclers didn't say. Accounts of St. Anthony's fire from earlier centuries describe blackened limbs, flesh falling off bone, sores, and the overpowering sensation of burning. Strasbourg's chroniclers, who were not shy about recording gruesome details when they saw them, don't emphasize those features. They talk about dancing, exhaustion, collapsing from fatigue, sometimes foaming at the mouth or trembling, but not lines of patients with dead limbs needing amputation. That silence isn't proof ergot wasn't involved. Our records are sparse and fragmented. Chroniclers may have left out details that didn't fit the story they were trying to tell, or that they assumed readers already knew. But for researchers trying to reconstruct events, the mismatch is hard to ignore. Modern epidemiologists who've looked at the case also point to timing. Ergot thrives in cool, damp weather, especially around harvest. Strasbourg's outbreak happened in midsummer during a heatwave, which is not ideal ergot season. Could contaminated stores from the previous year have been in circulation? Possibly. But the more you stack the details, climate, pattern of spread, symptom descriptions, the less ergot feels like the main actor. The strongest version of the ergot theory has gradually given way to more nuanced takes. Some scholars now suggest ergot might have been part of the background, not the headline. In a population already undernourished, anxious and religiously primed, even low-level ergot exposure could have made nervous systems more irritable, sleep more fragmented, muscles more twitchy. That biochemical agitation, layered on top of psychological and social stress, might have lowered the threshold for a mass psychogenic event, or lent a more physical edge to it. Others keep ergot on the suspect list mainly because our information is so incomplete. We don't have grain samples from 1518. We don't have detailed medical charts. We have a handful of narratives written by observers who didn't know what ergot was and weren't trying to distinguish between poisoning, epilepsy, psychosis, and religious ecstasy. So when people say ergot doesn't fit Strasbourg, what they really mean is, it doesn't neatly explain the specific pattern of behaviour, the way the outbreak spread, and the symptoms that were emphasised. It looks more like a later attempt to retrofit a simple toxic cause onto a messier human event. But the fact that ergot can do such strange things to bodies and minds is still important. It reminds us that in a pre-modern world, mad behaviour and possessed behaviour didn't always emerge from psychology or suggestion alone. Sometimes there really were toxins in the bread, parasites in the water, heavy metals in the cookware. The line between spiritual crisis and environmental poisoning could be razor thin, and invisible to everyone involved. In Strasbourg, ergot likely wasn't the smoking gun some writers once hoped. At best, it's a supporting character, a background toxin that might have nudged some vulnerable people closer to the edge. To find other possible culprits, we have to widen the medical lens beyond a single fungus and ask what else, in a 16th century city on the brink, could twist human bodies into such desperate motion. When modern doctors look back at 1518, they don't just see ergot and move on. They bring an entire 21st century toolbox of diagnoses and ask, okay, if this walked into my clinic today, what else would I have to rule out? And once you start thinking that way, the picture gets even more complicated. One cluster of ideas lives in the nervous system. Some neurologists have suggested that what Strasbourg witnessed might have been, in part, a kind of seizure disorder on a community scale. Epilepsy, for example, doesn't always look like the dramatic full-body convulsions you see in movies. There are focal seizures that cause repetitive, semi-purposeful movements, arms flailing, legs marching, bodies swaying or jerking in rhythmic patterns. A person might be partly aware, frightened but unable to stop, or might later remember only fragments. In a crowd, under intense stress, with people already primed to believe in curses and saints, those jerky, uncontrolled movements could easily be read as compulsive dancing. One person collapses, thrashes, then staggers up again, still moving. Another starts trembling and can't keep their feet still. A third, overwhelmed by fear and suggestion, begins to imitate what they think they're seeing. Not everyone in Strasbourg had epilepsy, of course, but neurologists point out that in any population, some people will have underlying vulnerabilities, a genetic tendency towards seizures, prior head injuries, infections that left scarred brain tissue. In the right conditions, sleep deprivation, malnutrition, extreme emotional distress, those vulnerabilities can flare, and that's before you add infections into the mix. 16th century Europe was a microbial minefield. Syphilis was relatively new to the continent and spreading. Untreated, it can eventually invade the nervous system, producing mood changes, delusions, bizarre behavior, and movement disorders. So can other chronic infections. Lyme disease today is infamous for strange neurological symptoms. Medieval Europe had its own mix of tick-borne and parasitic diseases that aren't always easy to reconstruct. There were also acute infections that caused fevers with delirium. High fevers can trigger seizures, hallucinations, and restless thrashing. A person in that state might stagger, cry out, flail their limbs, and then collapse into exhaustion. To a neighbour, it might look like they'd been seized by the dancing plague, even if the underlying cause was a sudden infection of the brain or blood. Some writers have floated more exotic possibilities, autoimmune conditions that attack the brain, like something in the same family as modern Sydenham's chorea or autoimmune encephalitis. In those disorders, the immune system, sometimes after a simple throat infection, begins to target parts of the brain that control movement and emotion. People can develop uncontrollable jerks, grimaces, constant fidgeting or dancing-like motions, alongside paranoia, religious fixations, or sudden personality changes. Do we know that anyone in Strasbourg had that specific kind of illness? No. But these conditions remind us that strange dancing can emerge from purely biological chaos inside the skull, not just from ideas circulating outside it. Whatever the immediate trigger, the background state of people's bodies mattered enormously. Strasbourg in 1518 was hot, hungry, and exhausted. Food shortages mean malnutrition, and malnutrition doesn't just make people thin. It can strip the brain of vitamins it absolutely depends on, like B1, thiamine, and B3, niacin, leading to confusion, irritability, tremors, and in severe cases outright psychosis. Electrolyte imbalances from chronic diarrhea, poor water, or simple lack of salt can make muscles cramp and twitch. An underfed, overworked heart is more prone to palpitations and dizziness. A body that hasn't had enough protein struggles to repair tissue or maintain stable blood sugar. Every system is running closer to the edge. Now put that under a July sun. We have reports that the dancers in Strasbourg were out in the open in blazing summer heat, moving for hours, even days, with little rest. Even a healthy, well-fed athlete will eventually become confused, irrational, and physically unstable with enough heat and dehydration. Muscles begin to spasm, the brain misfires. People stop making good decisions. So imagine starting from a baseline of hunger and stress. A few people begin to dance obsessively, driven by whatever mix of belief, neurology, and social contagion is already in play. Onlookers join. Before long, dozens of bodies are overheating, losing salt and water, frying their own nervous systems in real time. At that point, the line between psychological and physical symptoms disappears. Heat stroke can cause hallucinations. Dehydration can cause agitation and tremors. Low blood sugar can make you shaky, panicked, and irrational. The more you move, the worse those states get. The worse they get, the harder it is to stop moving. And this is where the historian and the clinician really part ways. A modern neurologist faced with a single patient can order blood tests, brain scans, toxicology screens, and an EEG. They can watch the pattern of symptoms over hours and days, try different treatments, and see what changes. They can ask detailed questions. None of that is available for Strasbourg. We're trying to perform a differential diagnosis, sorting through competing medical explanations on the basis of a few scattered narratives written by people who weren't doctors in the modern sense, who didn't share our categories, and who had their own agendas and blind spots. A 16th century chronicler might use the same word: convulsions, frenzy, madness, for epileptic seizures, ergot poisoning, fever delirium, psychosis, or religious ecstasy. They didn't have separate boxes labelled neurological, infectious, toxic, and psychiatric. They had natural causes, divine punishment, and demonic influence, and those categories overlapped. So when we read that people danced uncontrollably, or could not stop until they collapsed, we're already translating across a 500-year gap. We don't know if the chronicler left out vomiting because it wasn't interesting, or because it didn't happen. We don't know whether blackened toes or sores on the skin were so common from other causes that no one bothered to connect them to the dancing. We don't know how many quiet cases, people who trembled at home or walked in compulsive circles in a courtyard, never made it into any record at all. That's why researchers increasingly talk less about finding the cause of the dancing plague, and more about assembling a mosaic of contributing factors. If this were a modern case series, a good doctor wouldn't write "Diagnosis Dancing Plague" and file it away. They'd ask, which of these patients have clear neurological disease, which seem delirious from infection or heat, which are mainly expressing psychological distress through their bodies, who has been poisoned, who is starving, who is swept up by suggestion. In Strasbourg, we can't run those tests. We can only map possibilities. What emerges from that mapping isn't a single neat answer, but a layered one. A community hammered by famine and fear, some people with real neurological and infectious illnesses, others with vulnerable minds and bodies pushed past their limits, all moving in a culture that offered one powerful script for uncontrollable motion. A script that would prove dangerously contagious, not just through bread or blood, but through stories, expectations, and the terrifying pull of seeing someone else's body do what you secretly fear your own might do next. Once you start thinking in terms of scripts, you also have to think in terms of audiences. Because whatever was happening inside individual bodies, the way the dancing plague spread starts to look less like a series of isolated medical events and more like something we'd recognize today from Twitter storms, viral TikToks, and panicked rumors. Strasbourg in 1518 didn't have social media. It had something older, and in some ways even more powerful. Tightly packed streets, gossip networks, market days, sermons, and crowds with nothing better to do than watch each other. Imagine being in that city when the first dancers appeared. You hear there's a woman in the street who can't stop moving. You go to see. She's flushed, exhausted, sobbing or praying under her breath. People are whispering, "Saint Vitus," curse, punishment. Maybe you feel a twitch in your own leg. You remember your own nightmares about losing control. You remember the tales you were told as a child about saints who seize the sinful and fling them around like dolls. Now multiply that experience by hundreds. Modern psychologists talk about behavioral contagion, the way seeing someone else perform an action makes you more likely to perform it yourself, especially in ambiguous situations. You're not sure what's happening, you're not sure what's appropriate, so you look around and take your cues from the group. That's crowd dynamics 101. You don't need a disease or a poison for it. You need uncertainty, attention, and a story that makes sense of what you're seeing. The dancers in Strasbourg had all three working for them. Uncertainty came from the strange symptoms and from the larger crisis. Everyone knew the city was in trouble. Harvests had failed, prices were rising, authorities were issuing edicts about begging and luxury, trying to clamp down on a population they couldn't fully control. Attention came from the spectacle itself. These weren't private fits behind closed doors. The dancers were in public spaces, sometimes in the very heart of the city. People gathered to watch. Priests preached about them. Chroniclers wrote about them. City officials debated them. Every mention, every retelling added fuel. And then there was the story. Strasbourg already had a ready-made narrative. Saint Vitus, the punisher of dancers and blasphemers. Tales of Saint Vitus's dance had circulated in German-speaking lands for generations. People believed, or half-believed, or were afraid of what might happen if they didn't believe. So when some people started moving in strange, uncontrollable ways, the label slid into place with almost no friction. This wasn't random thrashing. This was the dance of Saint Vitus. It fit. Once that label sticks, it does more than explain. It prescribes. If you think you've been cursed by a specific saint in a specific way, there are specific things you expect to happen next. You expect compulsion. You expect loss of control. You expect more dancing. And because the human brain is suggestible, especially under stress, those expectations can become symptoms. You feel a tremor in your leg, In a different year, you might dismiss it as fatigue or hunger. In 1518, in a city watching people seized by Saint Vitus, you might panic. You might test your leg, see if it will stop. It doesn't, because you're scared and your muscles are already tense. Your heart races. Your breathing quickens. You feel lightheaded. Suddenly you're in the script. Officials trying to restore order probably made things worse. The historical accounts tell us that at one point the authorities cleared space for the dancers. They were moved to designated areas, even to a shrine, and in some reports musicians were hired to play to them, in the hope that structured dancing would exhaust the compulsion out of them, or please the saint enough to end the curse. From a modern perspective, this is like taking a small wildfire and building a neat ring of kindling around it. By gathering the dancers together, the authorities created a focal point. By arranging music, they standardized the rhythm. By treating the event as a quasi-ritual, they legitimized it. You weren't just some poor soul having a breakdown in an alley. You were part of an acknowledged, public, even semi-official phenomenon. Music itself can deepen trance-like states. Repetitive rhythms, droning melodies, and synchronized movement are at the heart of ecstatic rituals all over the world. They help the brain slip into altered states of consciousness. They numb pain. They narrow attention. In Strasbourg, music, open space, and authority approval combined into a kind of amplification device. Anyone on the edge, already half convinced they were cursed, already trembling with hunger and fear, now had a place to go, a rhythm to surrender to, a crowd to disappear into. And inside that crowd, something else was happening. Stigma and fear were doing their own kind of work. We usually think of stigma as a brake on behavior. If something is shameful, people avoid it. But in situations like this, stigma can also accelerate things because it raises the stakes of every sensation. If you start to feel odd and you know that dancers are being watched, judged, maybe even punished or exiled, you might hide it at first. You might avoid the marketplace, stay away from your neighbours. Social isolation cranks up anxiety. Anxiety cranks up bodily symptoms. The more you fight your own twitching or restlessness, the more aware of it you become. At some point, for some people, it becomes easier to flip, to step into the role fully, join the dancers, and at least be suffering in a way that everyone recognizes and, in a strange way, respects. Collective behavior researchers call this a feedback loop. One dancer becomes three become a dozen. Each new person validates the experiences of the others. Rumours spread that whole families are now affected, that the curse is passing through neighbourhoods. People exaggerate, misremember, fill in details to make the story more coherent and more frightening. The more frightening the story, the more people scan their own bodies for signs that they might be next. We have modern parallels. In schools struck by mysterious illnesses where students faint or develop tics, YouTube videos of the symptoms often circulate among the students. The more they watch, the more they talk, the more cases appear. Not because anyone is faking, but because attention, fear, and expectation change what the brain notices and how it expresses distress. Strasbourg had its own version of that mechanism, running on word of mouth and sermons instead of smartphone screens. What we see, looking back, is a city caught in a self-reinforcing loop. Distress feeding strange behaviour attracting attention, attention sharpening belief, belief shaping new distress. Once that loop was established, you didn't need a new poison in the bread each morning. The contagion was running on something cheaper and more abundant than any fungus or virus. It was running on human minds, inside human crowds, telling each other the same terrifying story until some of those bodies had no way left to respond except to dance it out. Strasbourg wasn't a cosmic one-off. It was part of a much longer, much weirder tradition. Medieval and early modern Europe had a habit of breaking into strange movements and altered states, especially when fear and faith were running hot. Centuries before 1518, chroniclers in the Low Countries and along the Rhine were already talking about people who danced in honour of St. John and Saint Vitus. Bands of men and women would travel from town to town, leaping, spinning, collapsing in trances. Some reports say they begged for alms, some that they were driven by visions, some that they were afflicted and could only be calmed by being led to a specific church or shrine. In 1374, long before Frau Trophäa stepped into the street, another outbreak swept parts of what is now Germany and Belgium. Crowds supposedly danced in the streets of Aachen, Cologne, Metz and other towns along the Rhine. They shouted, claimed to see visions of heaven and hell, fell to the ground writhing in pain when priests tried to restrain them. In some versions they foamed at the mouth. In others they begged to be cured at certain holy sites. Sound familiar? Public spaces, religious explanations, movement that looked half voluntary, half forced, a narrative of curse and cure. But when you zoom out, the pattern gets even broader. Take the convent convulsions. From the 15th century right into the 18th, there are records of nuns in Europe breaking into fits, trances, meowing, barking, contorting their bodies, claiming to be possessed by demons. In some convents it started with one sister and spread until half the community was affected. They would scream obscenities, convulse, or fall rigid for hours. Priests were called, exorcisms were performed. The phenomenon had its own script, its own expectations, its own audience. Or look at possession panics in towns and villages. A girl starts having fits after a family conflict or a local scandal. She says something about a demon or a witch. Suddenly others begin to shake, to cry out, to report invisible attacks. The community already believes in Satan and sorcery. The symptoms slot neatly into that belief system and multiply. Then there's Tarantism in southern Italy. From the late Middle Ages onward, people in Apulia and nearby regions claimed that being bitten by a tarantula spider would throw them into a state of lethargy, melancholy, or wild agitation. The cure was music and dance. Musicians would play the tarantella, fast repetitive rhythms tailored supposedly to each patient. The afflicted would dance for hours, sometimes days, in what looked like a cross between theatre, therapy, and exorcism. Tarantism has obvious parallels to Strasbourg. A bite, or the belief in a bite, leads to a compulsion to dance. Music is central. Crowds gather. There's a recognised, culturally sanctioned way to express distress that doesn't look like mere madness. It looks like an attack with a known ritual response. But there are important differences. Tarantism was often seasonal, tied to summer and agricultural work. It tended to involve individuals or small groups, not whole cities. The spider explanation gave it a medical flavour, a poison that had to be sweated out. Strasbourg, by contrast, leaned heavily on saints and sin. The dancers weren't purging venom, they were working off a divine punishment. And instead of being scattered across farms, they were concentrated in an urban centre under the worried gaze of civic officials. Convent convulsions and possession panics, meanwhile, usually played out in more closed communities. Monasteries, villages, small networks where everyone knew everyone else's secrets. Strasbourg's dancing was public from the beginning. That visibility changed the dynamics. It made the behaviour contagious not just within a cloister or family, but across neighbourhoods, guilds, and parishes. What all these episodes share is not a single cause, but a shared architecture. They appear in societies where supernatural explanations for illness and misfortune were taken seriously. They erupt during or after periods of tension, famine, war, plague scares, harsh reforms, or internal conflicts. They give people a recognisable way to turn inner turmoil into outer performance, using the language their culture already speaks: saints, demons, spiders, curses. They also tend to follow pre-existing templates. Once Saint Vitus's dance is a known thing, odd twitching can become Vitus's dance. Once Tarantism is a known thing, fatigue and depression after a hot day in the fields can become a spider bite. Once demonic possession is a known thing, anger or grief can become a demon. The details matter. The theology is different in a German-free city than in an Italian village. Gender roles shape who is most likely to be possessed in a convent versus who collapses in the marketplace. Local ecology decides whether people blame wheat, spiders, saints, or sorcerers. But underneath those differences you can see recurring patterns: distressed bodies, focused attention, powerful expectations, and shared stories that tell people how their suffering is supposed to look. Strasbourg sits squarely in that landscape, not unique in having people lose control in public, but distinctive in how big the outbreak seems to have been, how harsh the economic background was, and how tightly it was woven into the cult of a particular saint. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If similar scripts played out in so many forms, over so many centuries, what exactly were they revealing? And what were they covering up? Strip away the saints and spiders and you're left with a mess of questions that still make historians argue with each other in conference hallways. First problem, the numbers. You'll see books and documentaries confidently claiming hundreds of dancers, or dozens dying per day. But when you drill down to the actual sources, it all gets slippery fast. The city council records from Strasbourg mention the problem. They talk about dancers, about the need to intervene, about the cost of carting people off to shrines. They do not give a neat tally. Exactly 237 people danced. Later chroniclers, writing decades or even centuries after the fact, start throwing around bigger figures. Some say 400, some go higher. Are those eyewitness-based estimates? Narrative inflation? Moralizing exaggeration? We don't know. Most cautious historians now treat those big round numbers as signals rather than facts. Hundreds might mean a lot, more than anyone expected, enough to cause serious disruption. But whether that was 50, 200, or 500 living, breathing people, we simply cannot reconstruct with confidence. The same goes for deaths. The famous phrase, danced themselves to death, is incredibly sticky. It shows up in early modern writing, but often in broad rhetorical strokes. People collapsed. People were carried off. People perished from the dance. Does that mean literal heart failure mid-spin? Or does it mean the outbreak included people who were already weak from hunger and disease, some of whom later died, and contemporaries link those deaths to the dancing? Modern scholars are split. Some argue that, given the famine, heat, and lack of medical care, extended exertion really could have killed a fair number of participants. Others push back. They see dance to death as a formulaic phrase, part of a religious narrative about divine punishment, not a clinical statement about cause of death. Without burial rolls that say, occupation died while dancing, we're stuck reading between very dramatic lines. Then there's the timeline. Popular retellings usually give a clean arc. Frau Trophia starts in July, authorities get involved after a week, things peak in August, then pilgrims march off to the shrine, and the whole episode wraps up in about a month. It's a good story shape. It's also partly reverse-engineered. The surviving documents mention key dates, orders to clear certain streets, payments for transporting the afflicted, council debates about what to do. Scholars have to stitch these together like a crime scene board. Some think the main wave lasted 4 to 6 weeks with a sharp spike in the middle. Others argue for a more ragged pattern, a core crisis in midsummer with smaller outbreaks before and after, later folded into one continuous tale. That disagreement is tied to an even bigger argument: what actually triggered this in the first place? You've heard the main contenders: ergot poisoning, heat stroke and disease, a mass psychogenic illness, religious ecstasy, deliberate fakery, some complex mix of all of the above. Here, disciplinary boundaries really start to matter. Historians trained in reading medieval mentalities tend to emphasize belief, ritual, and social context. They see the cult of Saint Vitus, the stress of famine and debt, anxiety about sin and punishment, and they say, you don't need a toxin. The ideas themselves can move through bodies. In a culture primed for possession, curses, and miraculous cures, waves of involuntary movement and trance are exactly what you'd expect. Medical historians and neurologists reading the same testimonies often push back. They look for clinical patterns, symptoms that sound like chorea, epilepsy, psychosis, or functional neurological disorders. Some are skeptical that hundreds of people could simultaneously develop such intense psychogenic symptoms. Others think that is precisely what happens under extreme stress in tightly knit communities. Then there are the hard skeptics who doubt the scale of the whole thing. They point out just how few contemporary lines we really have. Maybe there was a small cluster of dancers amplified by rumour. Maybe later writers, hungry for a good moral story about sin and punishment, smoothed out the chaos and inflated the drama. To them, Strasbourg 1518 might be a real event, but one that has been mythologized almost beyond recognition. Why is it so hard to pin down? Because almost everything we know comes through layers of selection and storytelling. City records were written by bureaucrats who cared about costs, public order, and reputation, not about building a complete medical case file. Chroniclers copied each other, embellished, and framed events as warnings or miracles. Priests saw sin and saints, later physicians saw epidemic mania. 19th century writers looking back added their own romantic flair about frenzied medieval masses. Every retelling filters the raw event through a particular agenda: moral, religious, political, or scientific. Bits that don't fit the storyteller's purpose get dropped. Bits that do fit get sharpened, repeated, and over time start to look like hard fact. So what can we actually say without overreaching? We can be reasonably confident that in the summer of 1518, Strasbourg authorities faced a real, disruptive problem involving unusual, compulsive movement by multiple people in public spaces. It lasted at least several weeks. It cost money, worried officials, and was interpreted through the lens of Saint Vitus and divine punishment. The city responded by trying both spiritual remedies and practical controls. We can also say, with equal confidence, that the exact head count, the precise death toll, the minute-by-minute sequence, and the single true cause are beyond our reach. Those belong in the realm of models and hypotheses, not settled facts. Between those poles, what's solid and what's speculation, stretches the terrain where historians, physicians, neurologists, and psychologists still spar. One side pushes for thicker cultural and social explanations, the other for cleaner medical or neurological mechanisms. Each camp accuses the other in different ways of seeing only what they're trained to see. And that, in a way, is the real legacy of Strasbourg's dancers. They sit right at the fault line where stories about bodies and stories about minds collide, which is why, even with centuries of hindsight and shelves of scholarship, science still can't quite close the case. Part of the problem is almost embarrassingly simple. We're missing the kind of data modern science is built on. No blood samples, no brain scans, no tissue preserved in wax, no physician's notebook carefully listing pulse rates, body temperatures, onset times, and recovery curves. What we have are a few terse council entries and some highly coloured narrative accounts written in a world that didn't even have a word for neurology. So when modern doctors and scientists weigh in, they're doing something they're not very comfortable admitting. They're diagnosing ghosts. Was there fever? Sometimes the sources mention heat and exhaustion, but that could just be the weather. Were there hallucinations? A few later writers talk about visions and demons, but that might be theological embroidery. Did dancers respond to pain? Did they eat, sleep, or speak coherently between bouts? Did the movements look like jerks, tremors, swaying, spinning? We don't know in the way a clinician wants to know. If you showed a neurologist a modern video of the outbreak, they could at least start sorting possibilities. Chorea, seizure activity, Parkinsonian gait, functional movement disorder. Instead, they get adjectives like furious, incessant, and unseemly, filtered through scribes who are more interested in sin than in symptom clusters. You can build hypotheses on that kind of material. You cannot run controlled experiments, you cannot replicate the event, and you definitely cannot do what science likes best, test one variable at a time while holding everything else constant. Because in Strasbourg, nothing was constant. The city was under economic strain. Harvests had failed. People were hungry, indebted, and afraid. Religious anxiety was everywhere. Saints and curses were not metaphors, they were daily realities. If someone in that world felt a twitch in their leg and believed Saint Vitus had seized them, that belief didn't sit on top of biology like a decorative layer. It went down into the body and changed what the twitch meant, how it spread, how long it lasted. That's the second reason the case won't close. You can't cleanly separate culture and biology here. They're braided together. Take ergot, the hallucinogenic fungus that sometimes grows on rye. On its own, in a lab it can cause convulsions and visions. In a hungry city where bread is the only thing standing between you and starvation, contaminated grain is more likely to be eaten. In a community primed with stories about cursed dancing and a saint who punishes with restless limbs, strange bodily sensations are more likely to be interpreted as possession. People watch each other, mirror each other, and before long whatever started as a few cases of twitching from a toxin can become a self-reinforcing performance of suffering, or flip the sequence. Start with mass psychogenic illness. People under crushing stress sharing the same fears, primed by sermons and legends, somatizing their terror into shaking, spinning, and collapse. Now add in the fact that some of them are malnourished, some infected, some exposed to contaminated food or water. Their bodies are already on edge. Their hearts and nervous systems are less resilient. The same level of frenzied movement that a healthy, well-fed person might endure for days could push these people into heart failure, stroke, or heat stroke in a matter of hours. That's why some scholars land on a blended explanation, rather than a single silver bullet. They picture a summer where several things lined up: chronic hunger, infectious disease circulating in the region, maybe some localized food contamination, plus a population steeped in the cult of Saint Vitus, and terrified it had angered God. In that setting, a handful of individuals, maybe with particular vulnerabilities, maybe just unlucky, begin to dance compulsively, or at least uncontrollably enough to scare their neighbours. Those neighbours don't see random flailing. They see the script they already know, a saint's curse, an outbreak of divine punishment. The authorities react according to that script, marching dancers to shrines, commissioning masses, circulating the story further. The more widely the story spreads, the more people become susceptible to the same pattern. Their bodies respond to fear and expectation with real, involuntary movement. Some collapse, some recover, a few die. The city tries to contain it, and eventually, as with most psychogenic outbreaks, it just burns out. In this view, ergot or infection might have contributed, but they aren't the whole story. Neither is mass hysteria on its own. The event sits at the intersection of compromised bodies, overloaded nervous systems, and a shared world of meaning in which dancing could be both symptom and prayer, punishment and cure. The trouble is, every step of that reconstruction relies on probabilities and analogies, not hard data. We compare Strasbourg to modern outbreaks of functional movement disorders, to reports of convulsive revivals, to other dancing manias in medieval Europe. We ask what usually happens to stressed human groups with similar beliefs. We infer backward. It's educated, careful, and honest work, but it's still inference. Which brings us back, finally, to the people themselves. Strip away the big explanations, and you're left with individuals in a sweltering city, dizzy from hunger, scared about debts and harvests, listening to sermons about wrath and mercy. One woman steps into the street and starts to move in a way she can't quite stop. Neighbours stare. Some join, some jeer, some pray, some call the council. Days later, more feet hit the cobblestones. More bodies sway and shudder. More families drag exhausted relatives home, or hand them over to be carted to a shrine. Whatever mixture of toxins, stress, belief and neurology was at work, it was their muscles that cramped, their hearts that pounded, their skin that blistered against the summer stones. Science can model, compare, and hypothesize. What it can't do, not 400 years after the fact, is climb fully back into those bodies and those minds. That last step, from data to lived experience, is where the case stays open, and where the dancers of 1518 keep moving just out of reach. So what can we honestly say, standing all this distance away? We can say that something happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 that was strange enough, and disruptive enough, that city officials had to spend money and political capital trying to manage it. That alone separates it from rumour. We can say that the outbreak unfolded in a place already under enormous strain. Famine, disease, debt, and religious dread weren't background noise. They were the air people breathed. Any explanation that ignores that pressure cooker isn't really about Strasbourg at all. We can say that belief mattered. The cult of Saint Vitus, the fear of divine punishment, the familiarity with older dancing plagues. These weren't superstitious decorations pasted on a neurological event. They formed the mental scaffolding that told people what their bodies were doing and what might happen next. We can also say that the body was not a blank stage for those beliefs. Malnutrition, infection, heart disease, neurological vulnerabilities, maybe even localized food contamination, all of that would have shaped who collapsed and who walked away, who shook for hours, and who died. Put that together, and the most defensible view isn't a neat label, but a knot. A psychogenic outbreak amplified by shared expectation, unfolding in fragile bodies, maybe nudged by toxins or illness, steered by a religious story everyone already knew. But past that point, the trail goes soft. We don't know exactly how many danced. We don't know how many died. We don't know whether their movements would look to us like seizures, ritual, performance, or something we don't quite have a word for. And that, in a way, is why the story still pulls on us. Because behind all the unresolved details is a question that isn't medieval at all. How far can belief and stress go in shaping what a human body actually does? At what point does fear stop being in your head and start being in your heartbeat, your muscles, your temperature, your survival? We like to imagine we're past that with modern medicine and neuroscience, we've escaped the kind of mind-body spirals that turned a hot street in Strasbourg into a makeshift dance floor of suffering. But we still see faint echoes, fainting waves at schools, mysterious twitches in factory towns, symptoms that spread through online communities as quickly as any rumour in a Renaissance marketplace. The dancers of 1518 are gone, but the wiring that made their experience possible is still ours. Same nervous system, same hormones, same tendency to catch each other's emotions and expectations like fire. If you've stayed with this story to the end, take a moment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing that little map appear in the comments, this strange network of people scattered across time zones, all sharing the same questions about how our minds and bodies work. While you're there, it really does help if you tap like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who'd appreciate a very weird chapter of history before bed. It's a small action on your end, but it keeps these deep dives possible, and if your curiosity about long, precarious human stories is still awake, I've written a book all about the prehistoric bottleneck you heard about earlier in this video, the near extinction that almost erased our species, and the tiny group of survivors who reshaped our future. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you like at sleepytimehistory.com. The Strasbourg dancers left us almost nothing we can measure, but they did leave us a mirror. In it we see the same fragile circuitry we carry now, bodies that answer to stories, nervous systems that bend under pressure, and a thin, uncertain line between what we believe and what we feel. The outbreak ended. The cobblestones cooled. The records closed. The mystery didn't.